Okay, so now not only are we recording, which is the recording is going to be longer, so I'm going to have to put that up anyway, but we're also broadcasting live. So that means that people at home or who couldn't make it today are going to see this recording. Again, we are COMP1004 in the winter 2017 semester, lesson 1, part 1 of our broadcast recording. Questions so far? Anybody? I know this kind of is out there. Yes?
Does this course focus on C# or do you say anything related to Visual Basic or Dotnet?
There is no Visual Basic that I will touch in this course.
So the outline it's as Visual Basic?
Yes, yes. It's an older outline. We used to teach Visual Basic in this course, but we will no longer be teaching Visual Basic. It's kind of, I mean, it can be used for rapid application development as well, but it'll be primarily C# through and through. Why were you hoping for Visual Basic?
Because I studied some of it in my high school.
Oh,
yeah. I thought that would be a benefit.
Well, you know, the great thing about this is if you know Visual Basic, and that's a great question, then Visual C# would be brother, sister, cousin's uncle to it. You know, I don't know if that's a better way of putting it. It's not that much difficult or different from it, and we'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to get right into, if there's no other questions, my PowerPoint. I've actually put a PowerPoint up on Blackboard for you. It's kind of the first one I've put up, I believe. Should be up there. And if it's not, I'll put it up later. So how to get started with Visual Studio is really what we're talking about. What book am I using? I'm using Mike Murak's C# 2015. That's the book that we're using in this course. It's actually a pretty good read for what it does. And it's organized pretty well for what it is. It's kind of hard to find a great book with WinForms. WinForms, or Windows Forms, as they used to be called, is older technology that is kind of still being used out in the enterprise, right? So when we make applications with Windows Forms, it's common, but it's a little bit older technology. You're going to see why in a bit. It's one of the things that Visual Studio is great at doing. It can make a C# application with Windows Forms. It can make a C# application with as a console application, and there's others, and we're going to explore some of those today. All right, so that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about. Also, if you learn Windows Forms, all right, so this is one of the courses that's going to lead into the summer course. There are summer courses that kind of tie into this course. COMP1007 is the summer course relating to this one. And that course, what it does, it talks about web forms, Windows Forms, web forms. Visual Studio 2015, you're still going to use the same stuff. And it's almost identical when it comes to making web forms, with Visual Studio, so to speak. You'll understand when you see it in the summer if you stick around. Yes, I believe it's called Enterprise Computing, right, in the summer. So it's COMP 2007. So it's kind of a good segue. So if you learn stuff here, then you'll do stuff in the summer with Enterprise Computing. Also in Enterprise Computing, we'll be talking about MVC, Model View Controller. We won't be doing that here. This is kind of the old standard that we're going to be talking about in this semester. We'll be strictly talk about user interface design. If anything, that's what you're going to be learning here more than all the other stuff. So we're going to be talking about this Windows Form application. Again, it's just user interface. And I'm not going to be talking about, again, MVC. MVC is going to be something we talk about in the summer. WPF, I kind of mentioned that. If we have time, special topics, we'll be using Windows Presentation Foundation. I'll show you how that works. It's the new kid on the block, if you will. And when I say new, please take me with a grain of salt. I mean, the last 5 years new, right? Which isn't that new in terms of computers. And when I say the last 5 years, I mean it's taken hold over the last 5 years a little bit more. Still, 80% of our enterprise still uses Windows Forms, right? Same thing, 80% of enterprise that uses ASP.NET in any way or .NET technologies uses web forms, right? Even though it's old technology that's back from 2008. So that's why we're teaching it to you. We're teaching it to you because you learn Windows Forms or web forms, and you can apply it directly, in enterprise when you go out there and you do a co-op or a job somewhere in the industry. Okay. So what does it look like? You kind of create these little user interfaces. You kind of create the window, and then each of the controls that we put in, and when I talk about controls, I'm talking about things like radio buttons and labels and buttons, text boxes, all kinds of stuff like that, and other more complex controls. Of course, when I'm teaching, someone's got to call. This is the stuff that I'm going to be talking about. That's what it's going to look like. User interfaces are not that difficult, right, to create. And we're going to try and do this together as a class today. It's one of our exercises. Okay. Again, Visual Studio covers 4 languages. Visual Basic, that's the stuff that you're talking about. Visual C#, which is what we're talking about. Visual C++, again, primarily used in game development nowadays. If you're a game developer, you want to be into, kind of do stuff for AAA games, or even independent games, it's C++, okay? And Visual F#, functional programming. And again, it's taken hold as well. For the most part, I'll tell you, the differences are syntax and the way things are done. There's kind of a procedure that is done different from one language to the other. And people ask me, what's the difference between C# and C++? Huge difference, right? C++ is a much lower level language. It's much more difficult to learn, and it's more unforgiving, right? It's going to kick you in the ass a lot more than C#. C# is more forgiving. It'll give you more chances to recover and so on. And it's much easier to make programs of C# than it is of C++. C++, again, takes a lot more work. But why would you want to use something that takes more work? Because it's quicker. At the end of the day, it's more efficient. And that's why we use it for programming, for game programming. Anything intense, any visual kind of presentations we want to do that are intense from a graphics processing perspective, C++ is the way to go, right? Should you learn C++? If you're going to be a developer, I think it's good to learn a lot of good languages. I think if I was going to start off as a developer today, I would definitely learn Java, king of all languages in terms of making money, Java for sure. C#, it's good because Microsoft, it's a language for Microsoft. C++, I would learn a little bit of it. I would kind of understand how it works. Unless you're going to be a game developer, though, I'm not sure if I would go into too much detail with that, that language. Python, great language from an analytics perspective. Of course, if you're doing web development, you need to know JavaScript these days. It's kind of required, right? So, and they're all kind of linked together because they're all C-influenced languages, right? C-influenced languages comes from the original C language that kind of was a no-frills language to build, or a generic language to build everything from operating systems to video games. So those are the 4 that Microsoft Visual Studio supports out of the box. Could I get support for more? Like, for example, if I wanted to do things with JavaScript or whatever, yes, there is support. There are plugins. You can do great web apps with Visual Studio and JavaScript. It does also support HTML and CSS, of course, if you're going to do that. Although I have to say that if I was going to do a web app from the ground up, I probably wouldn't use Visual Studio. I'd probably use something a little lighter, some kind of editor, which is what we normally do when we program on the web. Unless, and I got to put that proviso in there, you're doing an ASP.NET application, then you must use Visual Studio. Or Visual Studio Core, which is kind of a new technology that's out there right now that's cross-platform. I don't know if you can look that up as well if you're interested, which is something new that Microsoft's been toying with. For years, Microsoft was, I would say proprietary, right? And nowadays, they've opened up the gates. They've said, we're going to open up our software so it's open source, some parts of it. And what they've done is they've embraced things like Linux technologies, which, for years they said Linux is the devil. And now they're good. They're happy with Linux. And they've made their products so that it's cross-platform. It works on the Mac. There's products that work on Linux, and of course, their Windows system. Okay, so that's Visual Studio a little bit. Something that I also want you to keep in mind is that, and this is the last line that I've kind of put up here, is Visual Studio 2015 includes something called SQL Express. We're going to be using SQL Express for some parts of this course. It's built into Visual Studio when you launch, and that's one of the things that you would probably, like, remember we talked about the difference between Professional and Visual Studio Enterprise. It gives you a few more tools in Enterprise when it comes to database handling than it does in Professional. Professional is very good. I would steer clear of Community. All right, if you're gonna use Community, sometimes Community gives you a much different look and feel and feature set than Professional or Enterprise. And one of them is this ability to kind of tap into local DB. Okay. So again, the things that we want to talk about when it comes to the .NET Framework, when we talk .NET Framework, we're not just talking ASP.NET. We're talking about the underlying framework that ties all the other languages together. And if I was going to show you a kind of an image of it, it kind of looks like this, right? So the .NET Framework has, on the application level, you have Visual Basic, Visual C#, C++, and so on. And then in the middle, what we have is a group of class libraries. And this is what kind of ties it all together, this middle part right here, right? So this is the middle part that kind of makes, there's almost like a common language runtime, which is this part right here, right, that ties all these languages together. So what does that mean? That means there's a common type system. So when I say integer in Visual C#, it's integer in Visual C++ and in Visual Basic, as an example. The syntax, again, I'm waving my hands here. The syntax may be a little bit funky, Visual Basic compared to Visual C#, but more or less, you're getting the same type structure. Also, all the same class libraries in terms of creating forms, the ability for you to tap into things like mathematical functionality and so on. All that is kind of embedded in the .NET framework that we can tap into through their respective APIs, application programming interfaces. All right, and of course we have our operating system, and I know they've kind of put in Windows 7, Windows 8, Windows 10, and other operating systems. Of course, I'll be using Windows 10. Not saying that's the best operating system. Definitely, I mean, people have said steer clear away from Windows 8. I was fine with it. Windows 7 is fine too. Please don't go back prior to Windows 7 in this course. Okay, that would be very bad, right? I mean, if you really wanted to, you could, but why, right, at this point? Okay, the IDE itself is an integrated development environment. It's kind of like, when, I don't know, did you guys use Eclipse, or did you guys use NetBeans? What did you guys use for Java? Eclipse, okay. NetBeans, right? And then IntelliJ, which I recommend. I think IntelliJ is probably the best of them. And the reason why is IntelliJ, I think, is the best one is because it just doesn't crash as much, right? NetBeans is pretty good too. Eclipse, I don't know what's happened over the last little while with Eclipse and IBM and the way it departed from IBM or whatever, but it's just not the same Eclipse anymore. I don't feel as confident with Eclipse as I used to. And neither does Google. Google's moved away from Eclipse, and they used to use Eclipse for Android development, and now they use IntelliJ, the IntelliJ IDEA framework to create their Android Studio. So that's why I recommend it. So these things that we're talking about here are integrated development environments, which means you have an editor, right? It does compilation for you, right? All those piece parts, and it builds the project for you in the background. So one of the things I will not be asking you to do is, hey, by hand, go to the console, build, compile, and run your app. It's not going to happen, okay? This is rapid application development. I'm going to say that a bunch of times in this course, which means I don't expect you to know things on the console in terms of building and manipulating your app. If you really wanted to go there, though, you could. Okay, so that's really what it is. It's an integrated development environment in terms of once it compiles everything, it creates, it kind of builds and runs your code or compiles everything in something called Microsoft's intermediate language or just intermediate language. And then from there, this assembly, as long as computers that you're kind of porting this code to have the common language runtime, then you can run this, your application on other people's computers. So even after today, we're going to do a little app today, when you build this app, you're going to get an executable file, an exe file, right? And you can take this and give it to a buddy of yours, and they can run it on their machine because you're building an application, a Windows application. Again, hence the whole idea of rapid application development. One thing to note is when we talk solution in Visual Studio, it's a container that can hold one or more projects. And we'll be talking about a project that we'll be using in Visual Studio. Are they recording me? Why is that camera on? Or are we recording us? I think we're still pretty good. Any questions so far with this? This is theory part. By the way, I'm going to try and keep it as theory light as possible. And I'm trying very hard not to read the PowerPoint presentations because that's really boring. Okay, let's take a look at a couple of other images. Not a lot of PowerPoint presentation left, if you notice, right? I try and keep it light like this every time. All right, so again, here's your integrated development environment. You have a bunch of projects, one or more. And why would you want to have more than one project? Well, sometimes we have a project that is just there for testing, a testing project, right? Or you might have more than one experiment, right? you're creating an application and you have kind of a pre-build, a concept, and then kind of a final build, and you can do that all within one solution, and it's totally fine to do that. So that's some of the reasons why we do this. Why Visual Studio allows you to have a solution container with more than one project. Okay, and this is kind of showing you what we just said. It kind of takes it in the integrated development environment, looks at the source files of your project, compiles everything, builds, and then runs everything in this, using the .NET Framework. Okay. So let's do a little demo. I think that's enough. I mean, I'm not really big on doing a lot of theory. So I'm going to do a little bit of a tour of Visual Studio and then how to test and debug a project. Okay, so for this, I need to go over here to my Windows 10 environment. And does anyone not have Visual Studio installed today for whatever reason?
No.
Okay, that's okay. That's why I'm recording this, and it'll be up later on. Actually, it'll be up now. The recording or the broadcast is happening as we speak. So hopefully you'll have everything you need. All right, so I'm going to launch Visual Studio one day. When Visual Studio 2015 launches, the first time you're going to have a little dialog box that pops up and says, hey, what defaults do you want, right? Do you want it to be a Visual Basic environment? Do you want it to be a Visual C# environment? Are you programming in C++? And whatever you tell it, it's going to default to that parameter. So when you install Visual Studio for the first time, be aware that that's what's happening. Again, it doesn't really matter where you start. I recommend Visual C#. Yes.
Do you have to have enterprise or just community?
I recommend, you don't have to. You can do whatever you like at the end of the day, right? I can't tell you what to do, right? I mean, it's your device. But I recommend highly enterprise or professional, okay? So if you need to reinstall, don't do it today, right? Some of you may decide to do that today. I know. That's fine. It takes hours to do it properly. I don't recommend you do that, right? Yes, I know it's really long and it's a pain in the ass, to be honest with you. Okay, I'm with you, right? But if you install Community, the problem with it is it may not include some tool, and you're going to see me do something, and you're going to go, "Oh, damn! I can't do what Tom did. I should have, kind of installed it at the beginning." So, you know what I would recommend, my friend? Bite the bullet now and install, and then don't cry later. Is what I'm suggesting, right? Because otherwise, it's going to be an issue. Okay. So I'm going to start off a new project. Okay, so this is how we start off new projects, of course. You'll get this little startup page, usually in Visual Studio, that comes up. You may not have this pane here, and I can turn it off. We'll talk about different panes in Visual Studio. Sidebars, if you will, right? Or toolbars. They're also called those things as well. And this is initializing components because I just updated my Visual Studio to the latest, with the latest updates. Okay, let me try this again. So again, I don't need to put these up. I can kind of minimize, or each of these bars on the side, if you see there's a Solution Explorer pane, if you will, a window, a little window for properties. You may or may not see these things. If you see something like this, it's okay. All right, it could be something like this that you see. If you're missing a window from now on, you can always go into View, and then all your windows are available right here. So all the windows we're going to be using are right here in View. Solution Explorer is the main window we're going to be using along with the editor that's going to come in the middle. All right, so again, I'm going to launch a new project. With the new project, notice that mine defaults to Visual C#, right? And there's a subfolder that says Windows. I'm going to kind of go down into Windows Forms, right? That's the one I want, and that's further down here if I was going to look at or different Windows Forms application. So you can see all the ones that you can do. Here's Windows Forms up here. There's WPF. We talked about that. If we can get to it later on, we will. There's a console application. We're going to be doing that today, too. I want to show you what a console application looks like, but it'll be today and never again, right? Just to show you what that's all about. Okay, so we'll be talking about this as well. By default, the default name is Windows Forms Application 1. I'm just going to change that to what it is. So it's COMP1004, Winter 2017. And then this is lesson 1, and we'll say part 1 because I'm going to do another one that's part 2. This is our solution. Okay, on the right, before I press OK, notice that there are a couple things. One is create a directory for solution. Directory, which is a folder, is going to be an outside folder that contains all the project folders within it. Okay, that's what that does. And you may have something else down here that says add to source control, as opposed to create new Git repository. Mine says create new Git repository because I've defaulted my version control to Git, right? So I recommend if you have something called add to source control, click on that now, or something like that. What does it say? Does it say add to source control?
Yeah.
Click that on, right? Because we're going to be using source control or GitHub for everything. Press OK. This is going to create the environment for you. It's going to pull up Visual C#, the editor in the middle, which is this piece. This is the visual editor. And you may have Solution Explorer on the right-hand side. I'm just going to pin it on. So again, you can pin it on or take it off. If you're using something often, leave it pinned on. You may also include things like properties, and that would kind of layer underneath. These are drag and droppable, these little panes. So if I want to, I can reorder things. If I kind of pull this, notice I can pull it here so it kind of rips off. Don't worry, don't fret, all right? Nothing bad happened, right? I can always move it back, which is a kind of a cool thing. I can kind of move this back. In order, if I hover on a pane, I can select, if I hover my mouse pointer itself has to be directly over that pane, and you can see how that goes there, or that goes there, or that goes down there, wherever I want it, right? I can also pull it over here. Once I pull it over to the right, notice that it kind of has another little selection box that comes up, and I can do the same thing. I can kind of pull it there, I can put it underneath, I can put it on the top, right? Anywhere I want to reorganize my window, I can put it, and it'll land there. So that's kind of a cool feature. You can customize your environment, and most integrated development environments, IDEs today, have that ability for you to tear off kind of a panel or a pane, sidebar, whatever you want to call it, and then move it around. Okay, so that's kind of the environment. In the middle, we have this editor area, visual editor, that shows me an example of a form. This is my first form, right? Notice that in the Solution Explorer, I have my solution, which is COMP1004 Winter 2017 Lesson 1 Part 1. That's the solution name. And also inside of there, a similarly named project, COMP1004 Windows 2017, sorry, Winter 2017, blah, 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 right? This project has source files. These are the source files associated with the project. There are two main ones that you have to really worry about right now. One is form1.cs. The CS extension stands for C#, right? And the program file, which is the main entry file or the driver file where your application starts, okay? Just like it would be in Java, right? You'd have a driver class. This is the driver class, program.cs, right? And it drives the rest of your application. Notice when I clicked onto it, it gave me a preview. And notice that the previews all come on the right side. The tab for the previews are on the right side of the editor window. If I double click, however, it now is open as a tab in the editor. Again, I can close these off, all of them, if I want, and have nothing in the middle. And if I just kind of click onto it, it'll show me a preview, right? So the example would be if I wanted to look at the designer, and we're going to talk about what that is in a bit. Or if I want to look at the program.cs file, I can look at it. But notice that the visual representation of my form doesn't come up unless I double click it, right? So double clicking the visual representation brings up my form itself. This is what the form would look like. And it should be, as much as possible, WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, right? However, there with some provisos. We got to talk about the things that might make it look different for you than for me, right? So far, so good. Anybody, everyone okay? I know I'm taking baby steps, and please forgive me. I'm assuming that no one's ever done Visual Studio Windows Forms programming, and I'm doing that because it'll fill in the gaps for some of you if you've done it before, right? And some of you may die. Please don't die. We will take a break shortly so you can go and get your coffee or whatever, have your cigarette, call your friend, whatever, and come back. do your social media, Snapchats. I don't know. But anyways, if you look at your Form 1, this is not a good name for my application, right? Form 1 is a lousy name, right? It's the default name for my application. And I'm telling you now from the first class, right? I want you to always change it to something that makes sense, right? So how do I redo this? How do I refactor this name? I right-click, and I'm going to click Rename, okay? When I do that, you can see that the portion before the extension, Form 1, becomes highlighted. And what I can do here is I can rename this thing to whatever I want. For example, I can call this Lesson 1, right? And that's a pretty poor name too, but we're going to see. Now notice it comes up, it kind of says something like this. It says, you're renaming a file. Would you like to perform a rename in this project? Please, whatever you do, don't say no, okay? If you were to say no here, what's going to happen is it would rename the file, but not cascade the changes down into the projects. So that means that there would be naming issues throughout the entire project. So please don't do that. Always click yes when you rename, okay? Now, it not only changes this, but also changes the other code behind files that are associated with it. We're going to be talking about what code behind files are. Okay, so lesson1.cs. The program.cs didn't change because, again, that's our driver program, so it doesn't matter. Okay. Let's rename this one more time. So just to give you another chance. So right-click, I'm going to go rename, and I'm going to change this to startform.cs. Startform.cs. And again, I'm going to click that yes button. Why start form? First of all, what I'm building is a form application, right? What I want you to do for each of the forms that we build together, I want you to add on form at the end of the form we're building. So if it's a start form, that's what it is. Start form is the right name for it. That's contextual, right? And the same thing goes with any controls we add into our form. For example, if I add a button, right, and it's an exit button, I want you to call it exit button. All right, please don't call it exit BTN. Spell it out. It's okay. C# can take it. It's not going to balk at a long name, right? If it's a little wordy for you, bear with me. There's a method to my madness, and it makes it easy for me to mark as well as for you to kind of associate what I do up here with the stuff you do. There are other conventions as well I have to mention. In the book, if you get the Murak book, what they say is start off with something like BTN instead of button, ending off with button. And the reason why they say this is if you start off with BTN, because BTN indicates a button, and if you're searching for all the buttons that are associated with that particular form, they'll all come up in a list. That's fine. We don't have to do this, however, as you'll see that we could simply use button with a capital B. I'm going to use upper camel case when I name stuff here in Visual C#. And that means that the first letter and the middle letter are going to be high, kind of uppercase. This conforms with the Visual Basic standard, right? And it also conforms with other standards as well. However, you may not be used to it because you may be used to camel case, which is the first letter being lowercase and the second word being capitalized. And that's fine too, but I recommend that we stick with the same naming conventions. If you were going to supply me a piece of code that wasn't that way, I wouldn't cry. If you kind of had your own naming convention, please don't use things like Form A. That would be bad, right? Or Form 1. That would be really bad because that's just like the default form. And please don't name your variables things like X and Y unless you're talking about coordinates, okay? Otherwise, they're not contextual. And then I got to hunt around and try and figure out what are you doing, right? Make your variable names in this course contextual, okay? So that they mean something. All right, let's run this funky beautiful application that we have that's going to shatter the universe, right? I'm going to click start. And when I do that, I'm actually running with debugging, right, in the background. And what it does, it pops up this little application. And there, we've made our first application. Yay, hello world, right? Actually, we didn't do a hello world yet. We'll do that in a second. And we'll do that a couple times, actually. Okay, so notice it says Form 1. That's in the title bar. So this part here in the Windows forms, again, I'm going to assume you don't know anything about Windows, is the title bar. We have our minimize button, our maximize button, or restore, as well as close. These are the buttons that are kind of built in or baked into a default application for Windows. If I click on the X, it closes my application, right? That's the default behavior. You can disable this, okay? So that's all it does. And from a default perspective, whatever you have in your form kind of translates. And I'd invite you to kind of, monkey around with it. If I make this form bigger by dragging the lower handles, you notice if I click on the form itself and I drag the lower handles all the way to here, I can make it bigger. I'm doing it by eye, which is kind of a bad practice. If I was going to do it more precisely, and if I pull up my properties window, you can see that I can monkey with the size more directly. So for example, if I wanted to make an exact 500 by 500 pixel form, or 500 points is what I should say, then it's 500 by 500 exactly, as opposed to what I saw by eye. We're going to be using our properties window a lot, right? It's linked to anything that I'm clicking on, so it's contextual. So if I click on my form, this is the properties window for my form. Each control or object that we drag and drop into our form will have its own context. So if I actually go to the properties window when I have a button clicked, then it'll be the properties for the button, okay, not the properties for the form. All right, we have a text property for the form here, and it says form 1. That doesn't make any sense. Let's just call this start form. All right, there it is, start form. Notice that in the preview it changes what it looks like. Also notice that there's a property called start position. Start position, right? Down here. Start position tells us what the default location is for the form to start. And it says Windows default location, which would be slightly different for you than for me, depending on where it is. You could change this by kind of doing a drop down and pulling center screen, which is what I like to put it. I like my windows to start in the middle. You may not. Okay. The other thing is that your window may be really skewed sometimes. And people always ask me, Tom, my windows looks terrible. Why is this happening? Why is my window looking pretty ugly? Does anyone know why? A lot of times it's because of your font. And you can change the different way the form displays. And if I was going to look at all the properties just from a very high level for a second while my form spins out of control here, you can see that each of these are the names of the properties that belong to my form object. Okay, it's things like auto size mode, where it says grow only, right? Auto validate, back color, which is the background color of the form, background image if I want to overlay an image, if there's a cancel button that's associated with the form, and so on. The control box, which is this whole title bar, pretty much I can get rid of by making my control box false. But if I did that, then I couldn't close my application directly. If it's enabled or not, and so on. There's font, for color, form border style, which is really important. If I leave it at form border style sizable, then I'll get something that looks like this, where I can actually physically kind of reshape my form the way I want. And that's, for the most part, what we don't want to do, right? Unless you have some kind of window that you want resizable, typically we disable that, right? So let's just stop this. We can stop it here, as well as stop by clicking the X button, right? So I can change this form border style on the form itself to fixed single. And then when I run this application again, you can see that I can't resize the form. It's just fixed to what I had it set at. Okay. So form border style, help button if there is one, icon, what's associated with the actual application itself that we're making, a key preview, localizable, location, the default location, if you really want to be very specific on where it starts up. My maximize box, if I want to have one. You know what? For the most part, I don't want to maximize my forms. I want to minimize my forms, but I generally don't want to maximize unless there's a reason why it's a form that contains other forms. Then I can maximize. For the most part, I probably would set this to false. My opacity, which is how I can see the form itself, which is 100%. You can reduce the opacity of your form as well. Start position and so on, all those things we talked about before. So these are the basic kind of form. One thing that I want you to change from the get-go, if you notice where it says auto scale mode font, all right, is I want you to make sure that there is none, right? If you leave it at auto scale mode font, that means when I change my font, my form will resize, and for you, it may look different than for me, right? So when you produce assignments for me, and you have auto scale mode font instead of none over here, the problem with it is that if your font and your DPI and your machine is slightly different than mine, then what you see is not what you get. I might get some really whacked out, application that looks totally different. So please, for our purposes, for this semester, auto scale mode should be none. Okay. Let's check this out again one more time, and then we'll take a short break because we've kind of gone an hour, right? And you can see that now my application does not allow me to maximize. It does allow me to minimize. This is my application icon, which I can kind of restore when I click onto it. And again, I have my X button, which allows me to close my application. Say that again?
Can we disable the button also, like it does not show up also?
The X? No.
The maximize button.
The maximize button, it'll be grayed out, right? If you have your control box, you can't disable it. You can't get rid of it. It'll show, but it'll show grayed out, the maximize button. The minimize button you can also disable. It'll show grayed out, right? So you can't minimize or maximize, but it'll still be part of the control box because the control box itself is an object that belongs to all forms. So you can't get rid of it. You can only disable it or make it invisible, the whole thing, okay? Any other questions for Windows forms? Yes. Yes, because you'd make your own toolbar and then you hide the other the control box and you make your own, and then you can make it whatever you like. You can make your own toolbar as customizable as you like. So the answer, yeah. Any other questions for this one? So very basics, and I'd like you to try that. Try fooling around with it a little bit, make a basic application. One thing, of course, it would be kind of remiss of me not to make a hello world, so let's do it. On the left, you should also have something called the toolbox, right? And it may be hidden. You can also bring it back. If you don't have the toolbox, you can go to View, and you go down to kind of in the middle, somewhere where it says Toolbox. Where would it be? There it is, Toolbox, thank you. And then when you click Toolbox, it'll pop up. It'll kind of appear there, and you can make it so that it is pinned on or pinned off. I like kind of pinning it on when I want to drag and drop, and unpinning it when I don't need it. So I'm going to go to Common Controls, and I want to put in a label. When I drag and drop the label, you can see that I get kind of like these control handles as I approach the borders, right? And this kind of gives me a handle of kind of the minimum distance from the border style, right? So I can put it in the middle. Notice it doesn't tell me that I'm in the middle. That's one thing it doesn't do, the smart kind of border, although I can figure that. I can put it in the middle by making some calculations based on my form size. This is an advantage to using WPF forms where you have different layouts as opposed to Windows forms that has no layout. It's absolute layout here in Windows forms, okay? So notice my label comes in here, and my label is a control. It's the basic control. Kind of the most basic control. The label has all kinds of properties very similar to the form, and if I'm going to go all the way down to the text property, I can change my label text property to hello world. And you have to do it right, which means you have to have a comma in there as well. That's the proper way of doing hello world. Hello world, right? If I click away, it'll pop up. It's pretty small, and if I want to change the size of my label, then I can go to the font, right? And if I click on Microsoft Sans Serif or the little ellipses here on the end, it'll bring up a font dialog box where I can change the size of my font. I'll leave the same font type, but I'll change the font size to 20. And then I can kind of recenter by eye. We can do that later on more exactly, but approximately right there. Or if you really want to, you can put it in the middle, wherever you like. And there's your hello world, right? So I've dragged and dropped the control from the toolbox onto my form, and now we can say that the label is a child of the form, right? We'd be remiss to end here, of course. We'd have to change the label name if I wanted to access it in code to something more than just label 1. The default is label 1. I want to change the name of the label to hello world label, right? That's the right thing. So hello world label, really wordy, but trust me, it'll help you in the beginning. Hello world label, there it is, okay? And now I can run my application, and I've got a hello world. Notice that, again, I can move it around just like normal, like any normal app. My maximize is disabled, and I can close it off. Questions before we take break? I know this is like baby steps, right? Please don't despair. This is not how the class is going to go for the rest of the semester. I'm just introducing this to you now, so that way you see the basics. Everyone has the same level, the same foundation as everyone else, right? So because I can go very fast, and I don't want to go fast, I want to go slow. Although I have to tell you, that's why I record everything, because sometimes I'm known to go fast. So just in case you want to go back and look at something that I did, you can look at the recording. All right, let's take a short break, 10 minutes or so, for a bio break, get some rest, get some air, and when we come back, we'll do some other stuff. Let me just stop recording now.